welcome. I'm Ruth Westerby. Welcome to the SOAS Centre of Yoga Studies. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Amanda Lucia tonight to speak to the SOAS Centre of Yoga Studies. Professor Lucia is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California, Riverside. Her research engages the global exportation, appropriation, and circulation of Hinduism. I've been a fan of Professor Lucia's work for some time. In fact, we read one of her articles for the Centre of Yoga Studies seminar series on yoga and gender in 2019. That was the article which was published in the Journal of the American Academy of Religions, Guru Sex, Charisma, Proxemic Desire, and the Haptic Logics of the Guru-Disciple Relationship. In addition to her many other articles, Professor Lucia authored Reflections of Amma, Devotees in a Global Embrace in 2014. Tonight's lecture draws on her very recently published second monograph, White Utopias, the Religious Exoticism of Transformational Festivals. I'm also very much looking forward to the outputs from Professor Lucia's relatively new research project on abuse. She's the principal investigator for the 5-year Religion and Sexual Abuse Project, which received a $550,000 grant from the Henry Luce Foundation. That project examines why and how sexual abuse persists across a range of religious traditions, including yoga and Buddhism. So tonight's lecture is entitled Romanticizing the Premodern, Positioning Yoga in the Context of Religious Exoticism. So I'm sure you will all join me in welcoming Professor Lucia. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming and this time. And everyone can hear me? Yes, can I get a thumbs up? Perfect. All right. I'm going to share some slides, so you may lose seeing me full screen, but that's worth it, I think, for the imagery. I hope you'll enjoy. Okay, so first of all, I want to start by thanking the hosts, Jim and Theo and Ruth. You are wonderful, and I'm so grateful to be invited, and to everyone else who's involved in putting this together. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to be here. And I'd like to preface this talk with 2 points of recognition. So first, even though I know that we're apart by an ocean, I am here in Pomona, California, just outside of LA, and I am giving this talk from Tongva lands. And so I want to acknowledge that and to also thank the stewards of this land for my presence here, my ability to work and live here, and to also recognize the performative politics involved in any kind of a land acknowledgement, and that hopefully we're doing something more than words at the outset. And that's a goal and an aspiration for me. So I'd also like to recognize that this book came to fruition between the years of 2011 and 2019 was the bulk of the research. And so that means that it was in proofs, that is to say that the publishers really don't want you to touch it, when police murdered George Floyd on May 25th this past summer. And if you've been following along, and some of you who may be in the States, the summer erupted into both Black Lives Matter protests and neo-Nazi aggression in the streets. And even in these fields, race became a topic of conversation, when in fact, between the years of 2011 and 2019, I think it's important to recognize that Black Lives Matter very much was not a topic of conversation. Therefore, it was not really a character in my field or in my field research, though there was a bit of activity there. In fact, what we found in the summer of 2020 was that there was Black Lives Matter activism on the part of many of the characters and informants in my field. And then there was also All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter activism, and people who kind of a real debate in the field as to whether Black Lives Matter was divisive and even anti-yogic in its recognition of human difference. So I don't really discuss that all too much. I stick to what I focused on during the time in which I was in the field, and that's what I'm going to start with today. So to start at the beginning, I first came to this project somewhat by happenstance, in that I was new faculty at University of California in Riverside, and that's in Southern California. And I was interested, I had been hired kind of at the intersection of ethnic studies and religious studies and the study of Hinduism. And I was hired in a religious studies department, but particularly interested in questions of ethnicity. And so I thought in order to learn more about the Indian Hindu community in the region, I would go to, I saw a flyer for a festival called Bhakti Fest. And knowing that Bhakti means devotion in Hindu context, but other South Asian religious contexts as well, I thought I would go and learn more about the Indian Hindu community locally. And so I arrived relatively uneducated in the Joshua Tree High Desert, which is known to be kind of a sacred space. Also a great place for hiking and climbing. But what I found there was a kind of 5-day extravaganza of yogis and kirtan artists who were teaching and performing. But I was really quite shocked to see that it was not the outpouring of the Indian Hindu community that I found, but mostly white participants. And so then I was intrigued by the field site to look at also how deep those commitments were among the white kirtan artists and yogis who attended. So I used a snowball methodology, that means follow the people essentially, and then subsequently attended Shakti Fest. And here's a itinerary of such of my research and what I was up to for those years. So first Shakti Fest, which is the partner festival to Bhakti Fest, same production company. Then to Wanderlust Yoga festivals in Quebec and New Zealand, Australia, and in the US. Then to Lightning in a Bottle, that's LIB at the top, and Burning Man. And I want to note here at the outset that each of these festivals are extraordinarily different. And in fact, I ended up grouping them into 3 different genres of festivals. So with Bhakti Fest and Shakti Fest as the most focused on Hindu devotion, then Lightning in a Bottle, then Wanderlust, which is deeply focused on yoga and even what we might call some kind of enchanted secularism. And then Lightning in a Bottle and Burning Man, which are more kind of straightforward transformational festivals in that they are focused on spiritual exploration and growth. And I see them very much as educational spaces as well, where people are learning about spiritual transformation and growth from a lot of different inputs. Burning Man, importantly, in recent years has disassociated entirely from the category of festival in an attempt to thwart the capitalistic exchange relations that increasingly define the term. So what I found in these festival and self-consciously anti-festival spaces was that people were coming together with aspirations of community building, spiritual seeking, self-cultivation practice, and renewal. They hosted an astounding number of offerings geared toward nature, music, art, dance, sexuality, spirituality, and importantly, they were drawing inspiration from the cultural forms of people of color almost exclusively. So the cultural and religious forms that I found most present were what I refer to as Indic and indigenous. And here I use the term Indic to refer to religions and cultural forms that first took root in India, including Hinduism, Buddhism, some Sikhism, and related practices of meditation, ritual, and yoga. I began to see these transformational festivals as under-recognized sites wherein the values of spiritual but not religious, or SBNR, people were transmitted. And therein, I found that yoga classes in particular were invisible institutions transmitting those values. So in fact, yoga was one of the primary offerings at each of these festivals. And I'll go through the rankings quite quickly. In Shakti Fest, you can see that yoga was the first. This is going from their program book, the #1 offering that was given, and then kirtan, breathwork, bhakti, divine feminine and masculine workshops, astrology, dance, hooping, if you don't know, is hula hooping, therapeutic workshops, tantra, and so on. Bhakti Fest was similar, again, yoga as the #1 offering, and then followed by kind of a relatively similar assortment. If you combined acro and slackline yoga with yoga, then you would have an even higher category there at the outset. Wanderlust focused more on what I called athletics, as kind of a lump category of running, surfing, hiking, getting in contact with nature. But then yoga was the secondary offering. Again, if you combine acro and slackline and yoga, you would have even that probably making it up to the first offering, and most commonly practiced offering, I would say. Lightning in a Bottle, you can see we transitioned to kind of a bit of a different kind of festival, straight, transformation, also a focus on music and party more than the others. So live music is #1, seconded by yoga, but you can see it's a very sharp second, sharp drop to the second, followed by indigenous religions and arts, dance, theater, improv, nutrition, ritual, sound healing, business skills, economic skills, and spiritual skill building, we might call it. And then lastly, Burning Man, of course, is known famously for the party and bar and alcoholic events. Of course, these are all drawn from the What, Where, When booklet that everyone receives at the gate when they arrive at Burning Man. So what's important about these figures is that it's not including all of the camps who are offering round-the-clock yoga that are not kind of specified in that book as a scheduled program. So even there, though, with these limited figures that are easily quantifiable, you can see yoga's in the top 10, as is meditation. So these yoga classes also operated in a sense that there were influencer yoga teachers who were teaching across the board and across the world in these festival environments. These are all pseudonyms, so if you don't recognize the names, that's why. These are the number of their followers on Instagram to show that they are kind of influential in the contemporary yogic field, or at least the ones that are popular on Instagram. And I found that I agreed very much with Bija Rivers, who I interviewed at Wanderlust Sunshine Coast in Australia, when she remarked, quote, "A festival class is not the city yoga class. The boundaries are expanded and people are more open. And people are more open in particular to the interior aspects." And she goes on to explain in the interview that people were much more open to bhakti or devotion. So in the context of the US, I'm not sure how it works in Britain, but studio yoga teachers are oftentimes restricted in what they can say by the studio management, and oftentimes are told to limit their discourses to the postural practice. Here in the festival spaces, in contrast, teachers were free to espouse their own worldviews and perspectives. They also, in some sense, had to do so to distinguish themselves in this highly competitive field. For example, sometimes a 90-minute yoga class would include 30 or 40 minutes of sermonizing, or what we might view as a dharma talk, before any physical movement took place. At other times, the teacher would interweave the postural practice with therapeutic and metaphysical discourse, guiding participants both on inner and outer journeys. Yoga teachers were self-aware of the power that they had in these open, raw, and receptive spaces. And as Helena Blake, another famed yoga teacher in this field, explained, quote, "What an incredible opportunity to be able to activate all this energy. We create this environment where people are healthy and happy and inspired and excited and motivated, and you get them to this super ecstatic place, and they're all looking to make a difference. And at that moment, they'll do anything," end quote. And I don't think this is mere hyperbole. Practitioners are coming to these spaces with knowledge in hand, but also very eager to learn. So as I moved through these fields, I began to recognize that not only were they predominantly white, but also that they were attracting whites at a much higher percentage than the geographical locations in which they were held. Furthermore, there was a correlation between yoga practice and spiritual engagement that made festivals even whiter. So that is to say that Burning Man and Lightning in a Bottle, with their foci on music and the party, were still majority white, about 80% white, but they were less white than the festivals that were more explicitly focused on bhakti or yoga. So here's the kind of chart to help you kind of visualize that data. Here's Burning Man and then Lightning in a Bottle coming in around 77.1% white, 80% white. Wanderlust, maybe 90, Bhakti and Shakti Fest at probably 90-95% white. And that's in sharp distinction to the places in which they are held and or where their headquarters are. For example, Nevada is 48% white, I believe. California is 38%, that is non-Hispanic white. And New York is even less white at around 34 or 33% white. New York is the headquarters for Wanderlust, Nevada headquarters for Burning Man and California, where the rest of the festivals are held. So I began to wonder, where is the whites only sign, and who put it there, and why was it there, and what could explain the demographic realities of these festivals? And I ended up thinking through this question for several years until I identified religious exoticism and its relation to whiteness, which became the foundation of my conclusions, and that's what I'll share with you today. So these festivals, importantly, are experiential and tactile and affective fields, and they're hopeful places where participants draw new futures, imagined in contradistinction to the crises of Western modernity. Here, utopias are created, envisioned as spaces to replace current dystopias. For example, Eli Gordon, a yoga teacher here, intoned his soft lilting voice during a full-day intensive yoga workshop. He invited dedicated yogis to enter into, quote, the waters of consciousness with a series of deep breaths. And as he spoke, he braided together an aura of sacrality with ideas drawn from multiple religious traditions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Zen, and Native American traditions. His poetic spiritual tapestries created a narrative that revealed humanity and the earth in crisis. There's a problem with modernity and a dire need for a solution. And like many others before him, he articulated the need in terms of a recovery project. That is, ancient wisdom has been lost and needs to be found and revitalized. So in his words, he said, Albert Einstein said very beautifully, the ancient people seem to have understood something very important that we have lost. And the answer is not, of course, to go back to the way things were thousands of years ago, because that would deny all of what's happened since. This evolutionary wave is coming together, which is so beautifully evident here in the desert. All these practices and different tribal members and colors of the rainbow creating a new way. And there are certain principles which are so important. And of course, nothing is more important than the mother, the earth. So in these few sentences, he blends together an admiration for science, but also the mourning of the loss of pre-modern knowledge, a demand for a new evolution, an affirmation of creating a bricolage of practices and people for spiritual innovation, a celebration of the unification of tribes, and a demand for the centrality of ecology. These are the ideals, and for him, yoga is the method. So he invited the practitioners present to imagine the world differently, to participate in a, quote, evolutionary wave, and to create a new way. But his vision for the different tribal members and the colors of the rainbow coming together to present at Shakti Fest actually didn't match the demographic reality of the predominantly white participants. So though they may use the language of tribe and claim that, quote, we are all indigenous to unify their communities, this doesn't reflect demographic realities. Oops, sorry, I'm gonna stay there. So today I'm focusing particularly on these aspects of religious exoticism. And I want to give a bit of background to that. I build primarily on Arun Saldana's work about the stickiness of whiteness. And I think it's really here where I build on his intervention. He says, it's a commonplace assumption that whites have for a long time been fascinated and transformed by drawing on other people's cultures and landscapes. Yet, the fact that white appropriations of otherness were fueled by a conscious effort to transcend the constraints of white society, that European exoticism and primitivism, though intertwined with colonial subjugation, also tell of the self-critique and self-transformation of whites, has seldom been put at the center of theorization. And so what my work tries to do is to put this very notion at the center, to engage in the uncomfortable juxtaposition between problematic religious exoticism and very productive self-critique and self-transformation. I argue that these populations identify with alterity to forge personal solutions to the struggles of modernity, and in so doing, they reject systems of white supremacy in which they're enmeshed, but they do so from within safe spaces of white homogeneity. So in festivals, they speak in self-affirming echo chambers imagined as evolutionary paths to enlightenment and rarely engage with ethnically diverse populations. I also found that the more yogic the field, the more it was focused on internal self-transformation as the primary agent of social change. So as the famed yogi activist Sean Corn writes in her recent book, quote, "Our evolution is the revolution." So while some yogis follow Sean Corn's advice for broader humanitarian activism, a much larger majority directs attention to personal evolution by engaging with what I view as ascetical and mystical modalities. And I want to, this is an example from Wanderlust Squaw Valley. Just briefly, I'm going to be speaking this weekend at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies online weekend school. If you want to hear more about ascetical and mystical modalities and some of the really genuine spiritual progress and interest and commitment that these fields have, I would encourage you to come. It's going to be less of a critical talk than today, potentially focusing on the religious exoticism aspect. So I have a chapter on asceticism, and then I also have a chapter on mysticism and the ways in which people are looking for particularly distinctive experience. And I question at the end, I show how these habituated practices result in affective experiences of freedom of expression. This is the most commonly iterated phrase I hear in the festival context, is people feel very freed and freed by the festival and by their spiritual work therein. And I question why this is the temporary experience of freedom is not resulting in the kind of freedom work of building social and political solidarities with the exotic populations they so deeply admire. So focusing back today on religious exoticism, at the foundation, I argue that the contemporary turn to Indic and indigenous religions is a form of religious exoticism. And if we look historically, we can see that Americans have turned toward religious exoticism whenever dissatisfied with the dominant culture. That is to say that Americans have engaged with indigenous and Indic cultural and religious forms in multifarious ways as a means to protest and reject Euro-American culture, by adopting the practices and exoticized practices of marginalized religious minorities. They've offered critiques as variant as those of industrialization, consumerism, rationality, violence, sexual repression, and the devastation of nature. So as the historian Philip Jenkins explains, quote, "The perennial American interest in Indians," and he's referring to Native Americans, but we can take the double entendre, "grows and shrinks in inverse proportion to satisfaction with mainstream society. Throughout American history, romantic Indian images are most sought after in eras of alienation and crisis." Furthermore, religious exoticism reveals a historical continuity in the particular cultural ideas and discourses that it circulates. And Veronique Altglass has discussed this very beautifully in her recent work. So for example, in the New Age bookstores of my youth, I found translations of the Tibetan Book of the Dead alongside Ram Dass's Be Here Now, translations of the Tao, shelved next to Mother Peace tarot decks, statues of Egyptian deities, and Native American smudge sticks. This amalgamation was congealed in the religious explorations of the transcendentalists in 1840s, renewed at the turn of the 20th century, revived by the counterculture in the 1960s, and sold in the New Age bookstores of the 1990s. And today, it's nearly the exact same set of texts and ephemera that religious exoticism continues to inform the spirituality found in transformational festivals. I also locate white interest in and adoption of cultural tools as a form of self-critique of Western modernity, a distancing from and rejection of the mainstream. But it's not fully distanced because it relies on that which an indigenous scholar, Eileen Morton Robinson, calls white possessivism. That is the simple notion that whites are raised to believe that they have unlimited access to possess all things. I apply this to these fields of representation to show how, quote unquote, whites not only explore, learn about, and share in cultural and religious forms of racialized others, but also go one step farther to embody, possess, extract, and redistribute that alterity as a form of social capital. So their access to alterity deemed exotic marks them with distinction in white society. It also identifies them as members of a tribe, that is, a tribe defined by an affinity for religious exoticism, comprised of spiritual seekers who have also chosen to identify with radical others as a form of critique of their own society, culture, or heritage. So my colleague Deepak Sharma writes that they, quote, imagine that they can transform from the oppressor to the oppressed, from the colonizer to the colonized. And he writes, surely such an imagined transformation is only available to those who are privileged in the first place, end quote. However, in contrast to Sharma's somewhat bleak view, as he titles his article Mimicry or Mockery, I found that religious exoticism can be an initial step in a gradual process of self-transformation, emerging from engagement with radically different cultures, customs, philosophies, and lifeways. And so in my view, the trouble lies not in the exploration and in the learning, but in the representation, in the white possessivist logics that further economic exploitation and cultural erasure of people of color. So importantly, one of the characteristics of religious exoticism is that it dissociates from real actors in favor of a romanticized imaginary, creating indices that are more malleable and controllable than their flesh and blood reference. So I examine these forms of appropriation and dissociation simultaneously and show how they result in very discordant transformational worlds that incorporate both the violence of cultural appropriation and the wonders of self-transformation. In the yogic field, I would suggest that the shorthand would be the commonplace practice of building relationships with South Asian yogic things, but not South Asian yogic people. So I know we have a yogically interested audience today, and I want to say just briefly in chapter 2, I do go into a detailed discursive analysis about how this occurs among yoga teachers and practitioners in these fields. And I don't have time to kind of go through this thorough expository here today, but I'll give you a little bit in brief. I parse the discursive field broadly into knowledge claims based in either local knowledge or universal knowledge. So on the one hand, those who derive their yogic authority based in local knowledge tend to build relations to India, the yogic lineages, and gurus. They may travel to India regularly. They may offer tours with students in tow. One would imagine that these groups would actually develop closer relationships and partnerships with South Asian people, but often their expressions are rife with romantic Orientalism, which functions as a deterrent to non-whites. On the other hand, those who derive their yogic authority from universal knowledge tend to set primacy upon their own spiritual experiences as the ultimate gauge of authenticity. So for these populations, yoga is India's gift to the world, but now that the gift has been given, it's ours with which to experiment and innovate according to our own personal understandings of truth. So these are very broad brushstrokes that I'm giving here, but what I found most interesting was that regardless of positionality, where one identified on this spectrum, the spokespersons for yogic traditions were all still nearly completely comprised of whites. So in what follows here, I want to ground down and give a few concrete examples from the field that signify the variety of ways in which South Asian presence is occluded and erased in these fields dedicated to bhakti and yoga. And I'll do so through 3 ethnographic vignettes, and then I'll wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. So case study 1, taking space. So in the book, I give a lengthy ethnographic vignette of Sundari Lakshmi, who's a woman who conducted the opening Kali fire ceremony at Shakti Fest in 2014. This is not her, obviously. This is the gentleman who conducted it in 2015. But she was a soft-spoken Caucasian woman, probably 45 years old, dressed in a black sari. She led the puja ritual geared toward novices, reading shlokas in Sanskrit and then an English translation from a thick binder as she poured ritual elements into the sacrificial fire. She had one assistant who was also dressed in formal Indian attire, that is salwar kameez, piles, or anklets, bangles, a long blonde braid, and then three others who were also her assistants, all white, two women and a man, similarly dressed in Indic attire, all relatively young, and it was clear that she was training them in the practice. So approximately 50 people attended the puja, which was somewhat traditional, with mantras to Kali, the recitation of her 100 names, offerings of fire, sandalwood flowers, clarified butter, that is ghee, and water. Sundari Lakshmi ritually bathed both the self and the goddess in a metaphor as she poured oblations into the fire. The structure of the fire sacrifice embodied Tantra reminiscent elements in that practitioners ritually transformed themselves into the goddess Kali. Then we were instructed to find partners and instructed step by step, body part by body part, in an intimate ritual blessing of our partner's body as a living embodiment of Kali. At one point, she exhorted, "Get intimate, you need it. Sometimes we do this puja sitting on each other's laps." And at this, everyone laughed. I think that was after she told us to bless each other's teeth. Afterwards, we were instructed to close out our experience with each other and return our attention to the fire while she concluded the puja with a communal meditation and closing mantras. White yogis and spiritual seekers comprised the majority of participants who followed her instructions to perform the ritual dedicated to the goddess. Sundari Lakshmi claims to be an initiated yogi, yogini, pujarini, lineage holder, and authorized teacher who has lived and practiced her sadhana, or her spiritual practice, with adepts in Nepal, India, and Tibet. Her practice focuses on the embodiment of the divine feminine in Shakta Tantric lineages, and she's serious about her study and her religious practice. According to her website, she's highly educated and has complemented her religious practice with academic study. Also decades of practitioner-generated knowledge and, quote, numerous traditional tantric empowerments and transmissions, end quote. Her biography claims that, quote, she is an authorized teacher based in this knowledge and that she can be found in yoga studios, festivals, and widely on the internet offering teachings, rituals, pujas, and online courses. And importantly, she's training novices. So I'm not in doubt that Sundari Lakshmi is in fact serious about her practice, but the ubiquity of white voices, even serious ones, can still create a crisis of representation wherein people of color are occluded and erased. So in this vein, Rupa Singh, an Indian American woman and a founding member of the South Asian American People's Yoga Alliance, or SAPYA, addressed a room of white yoga teachers tearfully with the following statement. She said, quote, "As you fill that space of representing yoga, teach in that space, know that there is someone who looks very much like my mother and looks very much like my father who is not there, who does not feel comfortable to integrate, to be in public in this country. Just know that you are taking a space that is precious," end quote. So Singh speaks to the manner in which white bodies travel freely in public with authority in universal spaces, while brown bodies are relegated to the private and the local. I would argue that cultural appropriation is in actuality a question of representation. It's not a root problem, but rather an effect of systemic racial injustice. So case two, I frame it as lack of knowledge. So in Kirtan and Yoga, South Asian cultural erasure has become so complete that one commentator on a Facebook post through Bhakti and Shakti Fest wrote, quote, "When I was in India one year, a white Kirtan couple came to perform for our group, and he said, 'I'm going to sing Kirtan invented by Krishna Das.'" So for those of you here who may be unfamiliar, Krishna Das is a Kirtan vocalist who was born Jeffrey Cagle, that's an image of him there, in Long Island, New York. He's a serious bhakta who's been singing Kirtan for decades, and he was nominated in 2013 for a Grammy Award. He performs at Bhakti and Shakti Fest regularly, but despite his many accolades, Krishna Das did not invent Hindu Kirtan, which can be traced to the medieval Bhakti tradition, if not considerably further back in Indic history. Similarly, Marissa, an inexperienced new yoga teacher, told me that in her teacher training, she read a Hindu text, quote unquote, something about a fajita, she told me as she laughed at her failure to recall the name of the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. It's this increasing modification of yoga practice in the West that have led Indian grandmothers, yogis, and yogis alike to exclaim, quote, that is not yoga, that is only exercise. So these examples are somewhat darkly humorous, but they're also vibrant examples of the practices of exoticism, because as the social theorist Svetlana Todorov explains, quote, knowledge is incompatible with exoticism. Its quote, constitutive paradox is, quote unquote, praise without knowledge. Okay, case 3, I call hubris. So when I asked Omkara, Jeffrey Goldman, all pseudonyms, one of the founders of Bhakti and Shakti Fest, about whether the festivals were trying to include Indian Hindus, he explained, there's a half a dozen motels around here that are owned by the Indians, and we support them 2 times a year. We fill them up in 1 second. We put them on our website, Super 8, Travelodge, High Desert. In 10 minutes, they're booked up, and they love us for that. And we let them come. So the first year we did it in 2009, they said, what do you know about Kirtan and yoga? And we countered, you don't know anything about Kirtan and yoga. Saraswati becomes Sarah, Krishna becomes Ken. They don't even use their own names. We are more spiritual than they are. When I go to India or I speak about India, and I've been going since 1980, every single year, I live there 2 or 3 months a year. I'm leaving to go in a couple weeks. They speak to me about different parts of India, and I can tell them exactly where to go, what to say, how to act like that. So I sometimes hear a similar rhetoric among academics and yogis as they lament that Indians vie to represent their own heritage, but they're not knowledgeable enough to do so. Such a claim not only denies the possibility of South Asian cultural expertise, but it enacts a paternalistic and colonialist stewardship argument in its suggestion that whites are better suited to govern and represent because of the assumed intellectual inadequacies of racialized others. Because Indians in the United States, quote unquote, don't even use their own names, we, whites, can, quote, tell them exactly where to go, what to say, and how to act. So in the diasporic context, such a claim is also wildly blind to US history, wherein racist policies and practices demanded assimilation that intentionally severed knowledge transmission across generations. Furthermore, post-1965 US immigration policies targeted skilled professionals, resulting in more Indian American doctors and engineers migrating to the US than, for example, yogis, philosophers, and religious studies scholars. It's true that some Indian Americans who demand to represent their cultural and religious heritage are not experts in cultural, philosophical, or religious traditions. But that does not mean that inherited knowledge does not exist globally, nor does it justify the erasure of Indian self-representation. What hubris to stand on the legacies of colonialism and racism and then assert that because a people has been severed from their heritage, the subsequent void justifies white projects to revive, dominate, and steward the legacy. We might think instead along the lines of a restorative justice model that would seek to recreate or reconstruct those connections where they've been severed and highlight the voices of significant populations of existing scholars and knowledge bearers. All right, so utopias are envisioned in contradistinction to the perception of existing reality, that is, utopia. Karl Mannheim explains that for this reason, we must recognize that utopias operate in a dialectical relationship with the existing order of things. They, quote, form the unrealized and unfulfilled tendencies which represent the needs of each age. And they, quote, become the explosive material for bursting the limits of the existing order. So then what are the characteristics of life for white, upper and upper middle class, educated, liberal, spiritual but not religious populations and late capitalist modernity that have given rise to this supposed utopian antithesis in the form of transformational festivals? In short, what is the problem that these festivals aim to fix? So there's no easy answer here, but if we listen to participants and how they articulate the festival, then I would suggest that taking the inverse of that, we might lead us to some suggestions. So most fundamentally, participants describe the festival as a place where they felt at home. And note the little home sign in the yoga class. This feeling of being at home with a supportive community directly relates to subsequent feelings of openness, connection with others, joy, and freedom. So then the inverse of this would be an unsafe and precarious place in which one feels not at home, or in other words, displaced, a society in which one feels isolated, disconnected from others, confined or unfree, and as a result, unhappy. Displacement, social isolation, and unhappiness have been major sites of investigation among scholars of anthropology, sociology, and psychology, as well as cultural critics in the past 20 to 30 years. I focus on particularly the recent work of Anna Singh, an anthropologist who's convincingly argued that precarity defines the modern condition. She defines precarity as the condition of being vulnerable to others, living with unpredictability, indeterminacy, and flux in an unstable world, and which are all thrown into unplanned and shifting assemblages. This is the ubiquitous condition, she argues, in the current context of globalization, wherein without stable structures of community, even the question of survival has become a reality for much of the world's population. Now, speaking particularly of the American context, Singh explains how, quote, a wild new cosmopolitanism has infected what it means to be American, a jostling of unassimilated fragments of cultural agendas and political causes around the world. American precarity, living in ruins, is in this unstructured multiplicity, she writes. The uncongealed confusion, no longer a melting pot, we live with unrecognizable others. This cacophony is the feel of precarious living for both white and colored Americans, with repercussions around the world, end quote. So as I was reading this, I found that the analysis that she's offering raises an interesting and fraught question that if precarity is related to confrontation with unrecognizable others, then is safety related to homogeneity? What makes participants feel like these utopian environments are safe spaces? Is it their ethnic and cultural homogeneity? So in 2000, the renowned sociologist Robert Putnam released a large-scale longitudinal study on diversity in which he argues just that. In short, he quips, diversity brings out the turtle in all of us, meaning that in more diverse environments, people recluse and isolate, and it is likely that some participants' feeling of safety and security and coming home in festival environments is directly related to the affluent, educated, urban, liberal, and ethnically white homogeneity therein. But I also suggest that there's a development of what I call an ideological commons in these spaces, a space of dreaming in common where there's like values that also tends to minimize diversity and engender similar feelings of safety, openness, connection with others, and freedom. These communities exhibit a high level of what Putnam calls bonding social capital, meaning in-group solidarity, but less bridging social capital or between group solidarity. Importantly, bridging group solidarity can only happen in diverse environments. So in somewhat of a cyclical manner, the ideological commons defaults into a gated commons that solidifies and re-solidifies ethnic boundaries. So while it generates feelings of coming home and freedom, it also reproduces the very homogeneity that is espoused therein. So today, I guess, in efforts to make my case, I highlighted some particularly egregious examples. And surely there are some in the audience who are thinking that these particular festivals are the problem, or yoga are the problem, or these particular people are the problem. But overt performances of religious exoticism are the easiest targets. More subtle are the attitudes, practices, and perspectives that it informs, which bleed into other social arenas far outside the confines of festival or yoga spaces. Exoticism also transforms into things like the model minority myth, or what Vijay Prashad calls benevolent racism, the stereotyping of an ethnic population based on positively inflected qualities. That is, Indians are so spiritual, Asians are so smart, and so on. It also becomes microaggressions and stereotypes and assumptions. For example, an African-American yoga teacher I interviewed who left the yoga festival after having been asked one too many times whether he too does yoga. Exoticism develops into pervasive cultural assumptions and the social effects of white viscosity. So throughout the book, I unravel what I see as a problem with the understanding that awareness and discussion of that problem is an initial important step. But I do think a bit throughout about the politics of friendship, which is an idea put forward by Leela Gandhi, building on Aristotle, Foucault, Derrida. And this idea that sharing of culture is an integral and vibrant aspect to living in a cosmopolitan and globalized world. But friendship speaks to shared entanglements and mutually beneficial exchange, a lack of control and an openness to the unknown. In a friendship between two radically different subjects, there would be mutual representation, benefit, solidarity. And I also think that these festivals have unique opportunities where they could bridge ethnic and sociocultural divides. They're skillful at building solidarities among strangers and cultivating affective experiences and feelings of communitas. The ascetic and mystical practices in these temporary utopias, participants are already engaged in sustained exercises, defying conventional boundaries and experiences with discomfort, mental, emotional, and physical. So if their utopias are to become plausible, actual utopias, they will need to apply those carefully honed skills to building solidarities outside of their current predominantly white populations. So I'll give the last word to Nico, who was an African-American DJ who I interviewed, ironically, inside of a covered wagon at Lightning in a Bottle, you know, with all of its settler colonial symbolism. But we took a reprieve a little bit of the hot sun and we talked, and I asked Nico what he thought of the crowd. And he mentioned that it was comprised mostly of white folks exploring non-white cultural traditions through Indian mysticism and African head wraps were his terms. And I expected him to condemn them, but he didn't. And instead he viewed it as a positive expression. He said, quote, "I think culturally speaking, white people are on the journey of evolution, of like embracing these cultures and getting to the point where they're more aware of what's going on, because they are. And it's a journey because however many years ago, it was totally a different climate. And you have to realize that it takes time for that. It's not going to happen overnight." And so I will leave it there, and I'm sure there are questions that will come about, and I want to thank you all very much for your patience and attention and time.
Amanda, thank you. That's brilliant. I don't know if you want to stop. That's a really gorgeous slide to end on. Really nice. Yeah, thank you for this. I think we really appreciate, above all, that it's we're talking about a whole book here, and you've been able to bring us a really interesting slice of it, which is, I thank you for that. I think that's can be a very difficult thing to do in and of itself. We do have some kind of great questions. We have, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase them a little bit and kind of double them up when they're asking similar things to make it easier for you to navigate. But we have a couple of questions, understandably, around how much you think this analysis can refer to spaces outside of America. Like, what is the picture internationally and globally? And I'm aware that's a slightly unfair question to ask, like, you know, because the spaces of your research are the spaces of your research. But I wonder if you had anything to say on that, or anything to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the I don't know, the benefit and downfall to being American, in some sense that, like, it is very particular to what's happening here, but yet America, I feel like, or I should say the US, there's no such thing in general, but I mean, I feel like in general, the US is very influential globally. So people do pay attention globally. The nexus of many of these yoga teachers, even if it is in California here, they are traveling globally as global spokespersons. many of the retreats and festivals that I'm talking about happen on what I saw as kind of a broad global yoga circuit, going from Southern California to New Zealand, Australia, Thailand, some in South America nowadays, Chile and Portugal and such, some in Europe, but I do think that it's a very expansive field that we're talking about, even if they're where they get their kind of W-2s or their tax IDs do come to Malibu, California. And then of course there's the internet, right? So we have people all over the world following and listening. And that's part of the reason why I put the Instagram data up. So even if it is produced and localized in the US to some extent, I guess I should also mention the international character of many of these festivals, right? Particularly Burning Man is a bit, about 25%, I think, international. That may be an incorrect statistic, but approximately 25% international attendees.
I think you're right. I think that there's in effect a kind of secondary form of cultural imperialism that's happening, wherein this American, particularly the American commercial way of doing things, starts to set the tone for particularly commercial yoga spaces in other places as well. I think there might be there's different things happening in terms of localization, and I just want to refer back because we launched the Routledge Handbook for Yoga and Meditation Studies, as you're aware, just last week. And one of the things that we're really talking about is that I think as a community here in Europe in particular is the need for research that does look at the localization in lots of different spaces, not just in Europe and South America and East Asia and various other places as well. So as ever, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. And I think one more point I should mention is, of course, you all have been watching from abroad the dystopian nightmare that our country has become politically in the last, I mean, it didn't all start 4 years ago, certainly, right? There's long legacies of ICE and Black Lives Matter, right? And Ferguson happened under Obama. So I'm not demonizing any particular political administration, but I do think that certainly this summer in 2020, things became really explosive here. And there's a considerable amount of tension among people in general, whether you're in line at Starbucks or McDonald's, thinking about race and identity in this country.
So it's a real, it's a wider cultural issue. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I'm going to come next to Matteo, who's asked a really interesting question on white possessivism. So hopefully, Matteo, I've just asked you to unmute yourself.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Amanda, for the beautiful, fascinating presentation. Very quick question. I was wondering, what do you think about the notion of white possessivism applied to the field of modern yoga research or yoga studies? Do you think that that's a reasonable, let's say, affinity, so to say? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a definite point in my field research when I think I had that epiphany, and it struck me with terror, honestly. When I was looking at this field and seeing it as such, and then recognizing very self-reflexively, oh my gosh, this implicates the academy in general, right? And of course, it implicates me and my own positionality. And I think that a lot of it actually came from my students. So I teach at a university where it is predominantly students of color. And here I was as a white woman teaching Hinduism. And at first of all, there were two angles of that. One, who the heck are you to be doing that, right? So there was a immediate invalidation and a question of, okay, who am I? And it made me think about how do I hold my own positionality? In what ways am I sharing space? Who's on my syllabus? Who am I citing? Am I helping or hurting the field, right? In this manner of thinking. And then two, that they didn't really care about India all that much. So many of my students did not come in with this kind of romantic, starry-eyed notion of mystical India being the source of wisdom and knowledge. You know, I had to convince them that this was cool, which was really different than studying at a kind of affluent white audiences that I had spoken with before. So I think in both ways, then it led me to a somewhat introspective journey about, why did I ever think that India was cool? Why did I ever want to go there? Why did I ever want to study this? And I think deconstructing that is absolutely important for every scholar, no matter who you are. And then also, like, why do you study what you study? Why do you do what you do? But then also, I think there has to be some movement, because I feel like I'll speak personally, into too many rooms where there's not partnership, there's not friendship, there's a panel of all white panelists, for example. And we have to think about what we're doing when we reproduce those spaces. So yes, I do, to answer your question, yes, I do think that it reflects back.
Thank you, Matteo. That's a fantastic question, and it brings me to another one on the list that's kind of related, and a fairly simple question asking more about your fieldwork experience. And I'm going to piggyback on that to ask you about how your positionality felt within these spaces. How much participant observation did you do? The reason why I'm asking this is because it's a big part of my work, and I'm very fond of the work of Ruth Behar, who wrote The Vulnerable Observer, and really interesting things around positionality for anthropologists and being in the field and what it means to be in the field. So I'm just wondering how that felt, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it changed over time. And I think with any long anthropological project, it's like that. So I feel like I went in a bit green, a bit starry-eyed, and I guess, you know, believing the rhetoric a little bit more. And I was always very close to the field in that I very much believe in participant observation, and I believe in developing real and intimate relationships with people in the field. I still, I ran a bakery at Burning Man actually for 4 years now. So I chose to run a bakery because it was not related to yoga. And at that point I thought I didn't want to skew the field by say, you know, teaching in a yogic space or something like that, and then believing that Burning Man's only about yoga, which of course it's not. So I decided to run a bakery, and I met tons of great friends that I still keep today. And so I also believe in a dialogical relationship with the field. So I shared my research with my informants, and they spoke back to the book, and they spoke back to my conclusions. And that was a secondary layer. I feel like that was a moment where I had another kind of epiphany, in that about 95% of people really were thrilled to be in print. They liked the way they were presented, or they were like, this is rad, you should do this. I'm excited to see this come out. This field needs this critique, you know, some rhetoric along those lines. But there were 3 very powerful and famous yoga teachers who were furious, and they were very angry to be included in a book on whiteness. They were furious that they were included in the term, and explained all kinds of reasons why they should not be included within the term. And I feel like those conversations, which I resolved in 3 different ways, really. One, we negotiated for about 6 months. One was just a heated conversation that got dropped, and she ended up saying, fine, go ahead. And then another was a yoga teacher that I in fact did erase from the book because she was adamantly disinterested in being involved.
Sure.
So after that, I think that it did kind of, that was maybe the last straw that maybe woke me out of my naivete, of my nostalgia, thinking that everyone in this field had kind of like done self-reflexive work and considered their own positionality and was interested in progressivist social and racial change, and, you know.
Yeah, Yeah, I think, I can recognize that crisis of faith. Thank you. So I'm going to come to our own Ruth Westerby next, who has a really good question. Ruth.
Thank you, Amanda. That was absolutely fascinating, and there's so much more in the book as well that I think that we're all going to be going through this for a long time. I've ordered it for the SOAS library and it's not there yet, but hopefully it will be there soon. I've got loads of questions. One of them, what are the implications for trauma-informed yoga, of the implications of Putnam's study that increased diversity increases a sense of precarity? If in a trauma-informed yoga approach, in fact, I suppose in all the scenarios in which yoga is taught, the emphasis is towards creating safe spaces. And what are the implications there around the links to homogeneity?
Yeah, I do think that's a brilliant question. It's not my expertise. It's something that I'm reading vigorously about, right? But trauma-informed yoga, I would say I'm certainly not an expert there. So just to say that at the outset. But I do mention in the book, there was a really explosive case that happened in Seattle a few years ago, if I don't know how closely you'll follow, but it was a yoga studio who had for a long time had a POC yoga class that they offered, but for some reason quite later, you know, several years after offering it, it made the news and went viral as a discriminatory and racist space. And a lot of yogis were very angry that they were offering this yoga class just for POC, people of color. And it was curious to me in the sense that I think what they were aiming for was precisely that notion, that there needs to be, their view, I think, was that there needs to be a space for people of color to feel safe and unassaulted by either white gaze or violence or microaggressions or whatever they felt might compared it to, for example, like women's hours at your local swimming pool. I don't think they thought too much about it necessarily. But then it became a target for a lot of people who thought that, for example, some of the arguments against it were offered that what if we had like an all-white yoga class? I mean, kind of funny not to say that in irony because almost all yoga classes are, but you know, those were the kind of arguments levied against them and for why they should not or should be disallowed from having such a space offered at their studio. I will say though, there are a lot of POC camps at Burning Man in particular, which also operate under that same idea and don't have any backlash really within the community at all. They're just great camps that are, I mean, there's all kinds of identity-based camps at Burning Man, whether like, you know, the Jewish camp, the Grateful Dead camp, the POC camp, on and on. It's a great question though.
Yeah, thank you. With a slightly more fun question, I'm going to come to Nick Lawler. If you can, I've just unmuted you. Nick, are you there?
Thanks, Theo, and thank you so much, Amanda. That was just so illuminating and just enjoyable as well. I've also ordered the book for my university library up in Lancaster. Hasn't arrived yet, but looking forward to it. So my fun question was, did you get the chance to ask the No Sanskrit studio owners what they meant beyond the literal meaning of their poster? But I think in more detail, it's really about some of the things that you've talked about in terms of teachers gaining credibility and seeking authenticity in the way they adopt Indic traditions.
Yeah.
And whether in fact you think it is authentic.
I was fine until you asked the last question. I think that the No Sanskrit sign, for a bit of background, I believe it's on a Core Power yoga studio, a very famous one in Venice. So Venice is a hot spot for yoga here in Southern California. Venice, California, of course, sorry, I forget, but we've just renamed everything from Europe. But I think that is a marketing strategy for people who feel that they don't want the kind of Indic experience. They want to be ensured that they can kind of stretch and feel good and get some exercise without embracing. I think it also probably has a anti-Hindu or pro-Christian context as well, right? That we do secular yoga. And I also think that there is a substantive thread in yoga today that is anti-guru. I think, for example, I think Cameron Shane has Kill the Guru logo. And so I think that there is an anti-guru, anti-religion form of promoting yoga as physicality and not related to India.
And that's very ironic given Cameron Shane's self-presentation, which is about as charismatic as you can get, but it's what it is. Thanks for that one, Nick. Yeah, and you know, I knew it would lead somewhere fun. And here's a tangential one from, I've got a John H, if I can find a John H. Ah, there we are. John, are you there? You've got a question. Do you want to ask your question directly?
Hi there. Thanks for this wonderful talk. Yeah, so my question is more of a kind of a cultural history question. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on the relationship between transformation festivals today and the US Protestant tradition of revival meetings going back to the Great Awakenings.
Yeah, brilliant. I love that. Thank you so much for that question. And so insightful. Yeah, absolutely. I think some more than others. So a lot of transformational festivals are very eclectic in their worldviews. As I said, they're more spaces of exploration and learning and communitas. Certainly the ones that are more music oriented are very much invested in the party and the escape and the tourism aspect of as well, in nature. But there were times at particularly Bhakti and Shakti Fest, which are particularly devotional, that I found myself really wondering if I was not at a Protestant revival. And I think a lot of the people who attend have in the past or currently have very deep religious convictions that are oftentimes informed by Christian upbringing. So they may have rejected their evangelical backgrounds, but they are now turning toward bhakti or toward yoga, and kind of resonating in similar ways, even performing a similar kind of bodily practice with arm raised up, weeping at the sky that you would find in any kind of a evangelical revival. Or, you know, of course we have to be careful, like whether we're speaking about contemporary evangelical revivals or the ones that happened in the Second Great Awakening, 1840 and such, you know, therein the Methodists were like rolling on the ground and barking like dogs. And I didn't see a lot of that, but certainly that they are occurring in nature is also there, that they are extra institutional in some sense is also there. Interestingly though, the revivals of the Second Great Awakening were particularly diverse. African-American and whites congregated together in kind of communal Christianity. So in that way, they're very different.
Thank you. That brings me to oh, sorry, I've just realized that this question isn't anonymous, but the person asking it has lost their voice, so I'm going to ask it on their behalf. So the question they're asking is, did you notice any difference between the ways kind of yoga and bhakti spaces operate? And I guess I would kind of add to that by just saying that I know in my work on the UK scene, there's really interesting kind of influences flowing from the kind of more postural asana into the bhakti scene and back again, which really happen in festival spaces in ways that they don't do elsewhere. So I'm wondering like the differences and the influences, I guess, between those spaces.
Yeah, for sure. They do overlap. Like I mentioned, there are some people some teachers, I should say, who felt particularly free to kind of, I believe one of the teachers in my work I quote her as saying, this is where my inner bhakta can come out of the closet, right? So that there are people who are operating in postural spaces that are kind of keeping a wrap on their bhakti sensibilities. And then when they get into a bhakti space, they can kind of let that go. So people operating in kind of multiple senses of self. wanderlust, I would say, I called it the enchanted secular. They are much more, or much less committed to bhakti ideals in general. So for example, instead of like Hindu deities in the corner, there would be like sacred geometry imagery, for example, which may also derive from a Hindu field, but is less overtly religious. And I think they are very careful about thinking about spiritual experience as being embodied in the intangible contact with nature, for example, more than altars and deities. So those were interesting spaces in contradistinction to each other. In relation to religious exoticism, I think sometimes it is more overt in bhakti spaces, where you have people kind of performing Indic identities quite visibly. But it's also quite subtle, I think, in other postural yoga spaces as well, more in kind of diffuse values and understandings of culture, which are maybe harder to pin smoke to the wall, but they're still there, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of, the performances are less obvious. Yeah, they're less obviously stepping into the role of kind of priesthood, of running havans and pujas and so on. Yeah, no, that makes sense. We have probably time for just one more, and it's another one from Ruth. Yeah,
thank you. I had a question around how you've been talking about freedom. You've talked about freedom in terms of affect, the feeling of freedom that people experience when they go to transformational festivals. And you've also talked about freedom in relation to the social and political realities of indigenous people whose traditions are being used in this act of bricolage. What about the sort of Hindu conceptions of freedom as moksha? So could you say a little bit more about those and sort of tie those different conceptualizations of freedom together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's chapter 5, right? And all of them intersect, compounding it to mean that me, as kind of an interloper walking through these fields, heard a lot about freedom, right? So whether it was about this kind of affective, I feel so free because I'm away from my job, or I feel so free because I feel safe and nobody's going to kind of harass me, or I feel so free because I can do whatever I want here, right? These freedoms from isolation and judgment and community and such. But then there's also the very kind of cultivation of yogic freedom that people are aiming toward, which also has a much, yoga in the West tends to have or Buddhism as well, tends to have a truncated version of when one would attain moksha or nirvana, right? This idea that like freedom is imminent, right? It's not that we're going to go through 100 lifetimes before we attain moksha, but we're going to attain it now in the next few minutes or few hours or few years, which is also kind of back to John H's point, kind of an evangelical notion, right? Or influenced by. Point being, yes, I think it's very much present in people's minds, particularly among the yogis, that they are striving for freedom. Some people believe that they've already attained moksha or that they are in process, and the whole construction of the self as on a path or a journey of spiritual evolution has that, sometimes articulated as like self-realization, but has that at the end goal, right? And being on a path and being on a journey toward liberation, toward moksha. I mean, we tend to hear the anglicized translations of it more than moksha, but I think a lot of those ideas are very much embedded in these communities.
Thank you. Excellent. All right, so I'm aware of the time and we probably shouldn't run over, and I do want to thank you again for being generous with your time with us today. I think it's it's been a great introduction to what is obviously a much bigger book with a lot more in it to kind of dive into, which will be really fun. And I'm actually, so that you don't have to, I'm going to ask Ruth to wave the book again so that you don't have to wave your own book. So White Utopias, what's the full title again? It's White Utopias. You have to unmute yourself. I'm going to get Ruth to do it so that you don't have to shill your book.
Exoticism of transformational festivals.
Thank you. That's fantastic.